if I move my view somewhere around here, let's say, you can see that we have some really high quality assets in here that we downloaded from Fab. The detail is good, everything looks pretty good and very highly detailed. But if I switch to path tracing mode, for some reason, you can see that this mesh suddenly looks pretty low poly at the moment. You can see that we have these really sharp edges in here, and all that teeny tiny detail, that crisp sort of detail that we had with Lumen is just gone. The mesh looks pretty low poly, it looks pretty flat at the moment. But if I change to lit mode, or if I switch back to the Lumen mode, you can see that we have this really good amount of detail in here. The mesh looks really high poly, and all that detail suddenly just came back with Lumen mode. But if I switch to path tracing mode, you can see that it looks pretty flat, it looks pretty low poly and not very highly detailed. That is not the case for this asset only. Even if I move my view, let's say somewhere around here, and switch back to Lumen mode, you can see that we have some good amount of detail in here. We have some really good looking cavities, very high poly mesh, very detailed mesh. But for some reason, if I switch to path tracing mode, all of the detail is just gone. You can see we have these really flat looking assets, pretty edgy, pretty sharp edges, not very smooth at all, and not very highly detailed in any way. So why is that? Because we want to use path tracings to get some really high quality cinematic looking renders. But if path tracing is giving us such a low poly mesh in here, of course we cannot render our scene with such a low poly mesh, because we need those cavities, we need those teeny tiny details, that crisp sort of looking detail that we have on all of these assets. But for some reason, with path tracing, it is not working the way it should. That is actually because we have applied Nanite on all of these static meshes, and currently, as for now in Unreal 5.3, Nanite does not work with path tracing, okay? Or path tracing does not work with Nanite. However you want to look at this thing, the bottom line is path tracing and Nanite currently does not support each other, okay? That is why you see these very low poly sort of assets in here, and all that detail is just suddenly gone. So how can we resolve this problem? Of course, what we can do in here is to just select all these meshes and simply disable Nanite, and then it will resolve this problem. But it will also introduce another problem, which is performance. Right now, as you can see that I am very smoothly navigating around in my scene. I'm having somewhere around 52 to 51 FPS at the moment. And I don't see any sort of lag in here. I don't see any sort of performance issues in here. I can very easily and very smoothly navigate around in my scene. And even with these high quality assets in place, I have some decent amount of FPS. Yes, I am running out of VRAM in here, but the overall performance is pretty smooth at the moment. And that is because of Nanite. Nanite dynamically changes the poly count of the assets that we have in the scene depending on the distance from the camera, hence giving us more detail and better performance. But if I disable Nanite, if I go into this Fab folder, go into the Megascans folder, go into 3D, select the static mesh filter, select all of these static meshes and simply just, disable Nanite, then we're not going to be able to move or navigate around in the scene very smoothly, and we're going to have some significant performance issues as well. That is why I cannot just simply disable Nanite to make all of these static meshes work with path tracing. Of course, if you have a very good GPU, then you can simply just go ahead and disable Nanite. And if you still have some good amount of FPS in your scene, then of course you can go ahead with the solution. But if you want better performance with your viewport and you also want these meshes to work with path tracing as well, then there is actually another solution which will optimize these static meshes for path tracing without disabling Nanite. So let me demonstrate this. If I move somewhere around here, let's say, and switch to path tracing mode. Oops. You can see we don't have that much detail, but if I switch to Lumen mode, you can see that we have all those details back. But if I select the static mesh and open the static mesh properties and set the fallback target to relative error and set the fallback relative error to 0, and then apply this change. Now if I'll go into path tracing mode, you can now see that we have all those details back with path tracing mode as well. And remember, Nanite is also enabled on this static mesh. So this is how you can optimize all these assets that we have in our scene for path tracing without disabling Nanite. But the problem here is that we have a lot of static meshes in here, and it's going to take too much time to, go ahead and select each static mesh and then set that relative error. So I'm going to show you a way, and by following that, you can set the relative error of all of these static meshes at once. Okay. For this, I'm going to make sure all the static meshes are selected. I'm going to open up this menu by pressing my right mouse button and go into Asset Actions and select Edit Selection in Property Matrix. It's going to open up this menu, and in here we have the list of all of those assets. Now I'm going to go into Nanite, open up this menu, and simply select Fallback Target in here to Relative Error. Right now it says multiple values because we just adjusted the fallback target of one of the meshes. I'm going to now save everything. And it's going to take some time to save all these changes. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and set the fallback relative error to 0. Now it's going to take some more time to, get all those static meshes ready. If it seems stuck, just give it some time, let it happen, and then eventually it will set up all the static meshes. So everything is done. Now I'm just going to go in here and save everything. I'm going to come out of this one, bring it here. And now if I'll switch to Lumen and, go in here, you can see that we have all these static meshes, very highly detailed static meshes with Lumen. And if I switch to path tracing mode, you can see that we have the same amount of detail with path tracing as well. Okay. So yeah. Let's see if all of these static meshes are working fine. Yeah, I think everything is working great. Yeah. Okay. So this is how you can, optimize all of your static meshes for path tracing without disabling Nanite and losing any kind of performance. But what actually happened in here, and what is this menu? That is actually a bulk edit menu. For example, let's say if you want to change some settings of different static meshes all at once, then what you can do is you can simply just select those static meshes and open up this menu, go into Asset Actions and select Edit Selection in Property Matrix. And now whatever setting that you adjust in here, it's going to apply to all of the static meshes. Okay. So it is a way in Unreal Engine to adjust a setting or different settings of different assets in bulk. Now, for some reason, if you have a lot of assets in your scene, then of course it can cause Unreal to crash. For example, if you want to disable Nanite to resolve this problem, then disabling Nanite for all of these static meshes all at once can cause Unreal to crash. Okay. So to resolve this problem, what you can do is you can select a few meshes at a time, a few static meshes or a few assets at a time, and then disable Nanite for those static meshes, and then take some more static meshes and then disable Nanite. So at a time, take only few meshes to disable Nanite. Okay. Same is the case with this bulk edit solution as well. For example, adjusting the relative error for all of these static meshes at once is somehow causing my program to crash. Then what I can do is I can simply just take a few static meshes at a time, go into Asset Actions, select this edit property with Matrix, open up the bulk edit menu, and then, adjust the relative error. Then come out of this one and then select a few more static meshes. Okay. Now, one more thing that I like to mention in here is that in the last lesson, I think I forgot to demonstrate something about the light bounces. I'm gonna just close this folder and go into the night scene folder that I have for path tracing. Select the post-process volume and go into the path tracing settings. Move this window just about there, bring this thing up. And for the last lesson, we discussed that if I set the maximum bounces to 1 and switch to path tracing mode, then light is going to come in from the atmosphere and then completely terminate. It's not going to follow its path or follow its trajectory, and travel around the scene. It is just gonna bounce off once and just terminate itself. Okay. What I forgot to mention in here is the front part of this asset, this character. If you look at the front part of this asset, you can see it looks pretty dark. Looks pretty shadowy and not very lit at the moment. That is because the maximum light bounces is set to 1. Because the light comes in from the atmosphere and completely terminates itself, that is why you see the front part of this character not very lit. But if I set the maximum light bounces to 2, now you can see that the front part of this character is very lit. That is because light comes in from the atmosphere, it bounces off of this plane and then strikes with this character and then bounces off of this character again and then it terminates. Okay, so that is why you see the front part of this asset very lit. But if I set the maximum bounces to 1, you can see that the front part of this asset is very shadowy. It's pretty dark at the moment. Okay, so that is what I forgot to demonstrate in the last lesson. So I thought I'll just mention that in this one. So that's pretty much it for today's lesson. And in the next lesson, I'm going to show you how you can optimize your scene for path tracing. Okay, so I'll see you guys in the next one.